Well, my sabbatical was a fascinating experience, and I mean truly remarkable. There are so many enlightening stories from that gift of time away to think, to travel, to pray. I've reflected a lot on the insights I have gained, and I'd like, over the next few weeks, with the exception of October 16th when the conference minister comes, I'd like over the next few weeks to share some of these sabbatical insights with you. This is particularly appropriate for World Communion Sunday, when we celebrate the gifts of the globe for us here in Houston. So without further ado, I'd like to bring you along for a few memories of India. One of my most memorable experiences was my trip to Haridwar on the river Ganges. Haridwar is one of the 7 holiest cities, or holiest sites of Hinduism. It's where the Ganges, this most holy of Indian rivers, comes down from the mountains and spreads its way across the plain as it makes its way towards the ocean. Since ancient times, and I do mean ancient, Hindus have believed that Lord Shiva, part of the so-called Hindu Trinity, visited Haridwar. He is the source of the Ganges. There are statues of Shiva all over the city, and our bulletin has one such picture on the front cover. In one spot, apparently the ancient elixir of immortality apparently spilled while it was traveling over Haridwar and landed in one particular spot. And that spot is now known as Har Ki Puri. Every day, people gather from all over India to celebrate a Ganga Arti, I get that right, Ganga Arti, where offerings are made to the river Ganges at this one holy site, Har Ki Puri. It was something I didn't want to miss. So, around 4:30 p.m. in the afternoon, I arrived at Har Ki Puri. Vendors were set up all along the shore, selling various things from food to trinkets, to the leaves and food with candles in them that were then to be offered on the river and floated down the river later during the ceremony. And it was hot, temperature-wise. I mean, it was like hot. No AC anywhere in sight. Trust me, I was looking around for it desperately. It's a good thing that Houston has given me some practice in the heat. If I had come straight from Boston, I think I probably would have wilted and died. Among the 10,000 or so people there, I was the only white person that I saw. People were swimming in the Ganges, partly to cool off and partly to receive the spiritual blessings that bathing in that river brings. And after several hours in the wilting heat, the light began to dim and the arti began. It involved singing and drums and braziers with flames soaring aloft, lifted above by priests in their saffron-colored robes. And then, in a development that seemed shocking to me, these same braziers were then handed around the crowds. As the foot-high flames were shakily passed from one literally outstretched arm to another, I was convinced that it would fall on the crowds. Thankfully, it did not happen. But I have to say, after it was all done, I was left a little bit confused. What was this all about? What was the point of all this noise and jubilation and hours of waiting? There was no praying, at least praying as I think of it. People were talking about me, talking around to each other during the whole ceremony. It seemed more like a show for the crowd, almost as though being there in that place alone is what mattered most. Was it really about drifting a few flowers down the river to gain merit? If so, why had there not been some great solemn moment when we all did that? It's just randomly, one after another, a few of these leaves with candles would float by. And yet, as weird as the arti experience was for me, it was the experience just beforehand that really flummoxed me. Haridwar, unsurprisingly, has temples all over the city. You think there are a lot of churches in Houston? Go to a place like Haridwar. You couldn't walk 100 feet without running into a temple or a holy shrine. And the driver I hired for the day took me to one of the holiest sites in Haridwar. It was a temple up on the mountain overlooking the Ganges. The temple, Chanda Devi, was dedicated to one of the best-known goddesses in Hinduism. Supposedly, that goddess had visited that mountain thousands of years before, even though the temple that I was visiting was only built in the 19th century. Now, there were 2 ways to the temple. One was up a winding path to the mountain, and in 100-degree weather, that didn't seem like the best of options. The other was via a gondola cable car, and it was an old-school gondola that must have been built back in the 1970s. I cautiously approached the large crowd waiting for the gondola. At the ticket window, the vendor warned me that the wait would be 90 minutes or more to get on the gondola. I looked around at the crowd sitting there and milling about and said to myself, well, if it's good enough for these Indians, it's good enough for me. So I sat and waited while I read a book on the convenient Kindle app on my phone. Now, after a long wait, it came my turn to ride the gondola. And one of the people in the gondola with me was an elderly woman. This is one of these small gondolas that fits 4 people. Elderly woman, I could see by the look on her face that she was terrified of this experience. She kept muttering prayers to herself all the way up the mountain while her husband tried to calm her down. She barely noticed the scenery, the beautiful scenery that was unfolding all around us. Now, once we disembarked, covered in sweat, I followed the crowd up the pathway to the temple. All along the sides of the temple, people were selling various things, mostly food to be offered to the goddess herself. Thankfully, they'd erected a plastic covering that sheltered us from the sun above, but it also meant that we couldn't see the scenery beyond us as we walked up this path. And as I approached the temple, there were stalls where people were taking off their shoes. It is the custom in temples all across India to remove your shoes before entering. I found out later that beyond the obvious reason for not trekking in dirt, the soles of your shoes were thought to be spiritually polluted. I had no idea where I was going or what it would look like on the other side, so I was not about to hand over my only pair of shoes to some perfect stranger. I removed my shoes, but then I quickly stuffed them into my backpack, and one man yelled at me that I wasn't allowed to do that. And of course, he was one of the people who was collecting shoes for a fee. I ignored him and quickly got back in line to enter the temple itself. Now, the entrance to the temple was anything but impressive. No art or architectural features, just barriers set up to corral the crowds waiting to enter the inner area. I shuffled along, keeping my eyes peeled for any potential pickpockets, while I bumped against those around me. We climbed a flight of concrete stairs, jostled step by step, and then I caught a glimpse of the statue that we'd all come to see. It was not very large, maybe 2 feet tall. It was surrounded by a small shrine. In front of the idol were 2 men and a security guard. As people shuffled by, the 2 men took the food and flour offerings and stuffed them into large garbage bags that they had. They just shoved them in there. It was like one after another, next. I mean, it was amazing how quickly the crowd was moving by. The security guard was there to hurry people along, so you literally had no more than a couple seconds in front of the idol. Now, one woman attempted to get down on her knees so she could worship the idol, but the security man brusquely told her to get up and move along. After I passed the statue, I found myself in a rather unimpressive corridor that led to the exit. The windows were covered with mesh, which people had tied red pieces of paper to, so you couldn't actually see anything beyond, the beautiful view beyond. And before I knew it, I was outside the temple in a place that was entirely different from where I had entered and where I was supposed to take off my shoes. I breathed a sigh of relief that I still had my shoes with me. And not being able to find my way back to the gondola, I followed down the path that, some 3 miles later, dumped me out into the road where it was nowhere near my driver had dropped me off, this in 100-degree heat. And that was it. That was my visit to this holy site dedicated to the goddess Devi. Talk about being confused. I had waited roughly 2.5 hours for a few-second glimpse of a statue. There was no place to pray, no place even to sit down. The temple itself was unremarkable. There was nothing beautiful about it, or at least that I could see. My time in front of the statue was so limited, I couldn't even tell you what the statue looked like. So this is Hindu devotion? What on earth was I missing? What was holy or sacred about what I had just done? Why did people come from all over India to do what I had just done? Gaze on a small statue for 10 seconds, at best? That was it? Later, I spoke with some Hindus to try and sort out what had happened. Surely I was missing something. What I was told is that people waited in line for Darshan. Darshan literally comes from the Sanskrit word meaning sight. Darshan has various definitions and uses in Hinduism, but the particular type of darshan that I experienced was that glimpse of the statue, the idol. By merely looking at that statue, I had supposedly gained merit from the goddess. Her sight, that idol's image, was sanctifying in some way. I didn't feel particularly holy at any point during that experience. The people around me didn't seem to be in a sense of awe. It felt more like they were going through the motions. They left offerings for the idol so they could gain some material benefit from the goddess, whether it be a new job, a new child, perhaps some sort of healing. After my experience at Hardwar, I ventured into a number of other well-known Hindu temples around India. And each time it was much the same thing. The long line, the small idol, offerings given, and a momentary glance at the statue. I really tried, to figure out what was going on. What is this Darshan concept? It seemed to me to be nothing more than the Hindu version of the prosperity gospel, if I were to be honest. Give your offerings, get some material benefit back. Several of the Hindus I spoke to affirmed that I was right. Now, these were fairly cynical Hindus who weren't practicing, but nevertheless, there was it is that simple. You wait in line, you give your offering, you look at the statue, you go on your way, and then you get a raise at work. But I had a hard time accepting that. This was Hinduism, one of the great religions of the world. There had to be something I was missing. Darshan, sight? What was going on? This is a major part of Hinduism, the most common devotion at a temple if you go visit one. Now, a week and a half after leaving Hardwar, I made a day trip from Delhi to Agra to see the Taj Mahal. I have to be honest, I almost didn't go. I have seen hundreds of pictures of the Taj Mahal. I remember that scene in Slumdog Millionaire where the main character and his brother cheat tourists and steal their shoes that were laying out there. You remember that scene? Everything I'd read about the Taj Mahal mentioned the endless crowds. And moreover, it was not inexpensive to see. The only way I could make it there and back in a day was to hire a driver to take me on the 8-hour round trip, and then to hire a guide also to walk me through the Taj Mahal. And then again, the prices for people from the West are different than the prices for Indians. But again, I figured this might be my only chance to see the Taj Mahal, and I couldn't tell people I didn't go see the Taj Mahal. So I was like, okay, I'll go. So I woke up at 5 a.m. and very reluctantly made the journey. Now, one benefit of seeing the Taj Mahal in the wake of COVID and in the middle of the heat and monsoon season was that the crowds were actually small. That was good. And the building itself, if you've been there, was far smaller than I had imagined from seeing pictures, much like the Alamo when I visited San Antonio. I was like, that's the Alamo, you know? But one thing I was not prepared for was the beauty of the building. It was stunning in the literal sense of that word. When I saw it, I just could not keep my eyes off it. I just stared, and I could have stared at the Taj Mahal for hours, in spite of the heat. It's hard to describe. The building took 20 years to complete. It's a mausoleum for the former Mughal emperor's wife, who had died in childbirth at age 38. She was the love of his life. And since he was one of the wealthiest people on the planet at the time, he decided to build the absolute most beautiful thing he could to honor her and spare no expense. And I have to say, it is the most beautiful building I've ever seen. It was nothing less than sublime. There was this feeling in viewing it that has to be experienced in person. It elevated the soul. While sitting there staring at the Taj Mahal, I couldn't help but think to myself, maybe this is something that Darshan has to do with. There are some places, things, objects that are so sublime that in their presence you can see and be seen by the divine. I understand why people would want to gaze on such a thing. I can see why people say that gazing on certain statues can bring you in contact with the divine. I got it, or at least I thought I did. I might not have understood the whole concept of Hardwar, and I'm sure someone who is Hindu here would give me lots of critiques afterwards. But there, staring at the Taj Mahal for the first time, that sense of Darshan made sense to me. And wandering those grounds, I couldn't help about the famous lines from the psalm that we read this morning, Psalm 84. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul long, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. Happy are those who live in your house, ever singing your praise. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than live in the tents of wickedness. Yes. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Have you ever experienced that? that kind of sublimity? Do you know what the psalmist is talking about? During the Protestant Reformation, Reformed Protestants, that is, those who took the Reformation to its logical conclusion, like the Congregationalists and other Calvinists, Reformed Protestants hated the images and statues and architecture of the Roman Catholic Church. Reformed Protestants rejected the worship of saints as sacrilegious and against the Bible. Many of these early Protestants were iconoclasts. They literally tore down images of saints and religious art in churches, including beautiful stained glass windows. Devotion to God was about faith and believing the correct theology. It was about reading the Bible for yourself and understanding it. Reformed Protestants were all about education and learning. The tradition is very much one of our head and our mind. We come to God through our minds and rational thought. That's how we enter our hearts, at least according to Reformed Protestants. I mean, after all, I'm wearing an academic gown to preach to you for a reason. Now, this is why Congregationalists, of course, built their sanctuaries without adornment. It's also why the concept of Darshan can be so tricky for us. I think that's one of the reasons why it was so hard for me in India. We don't have images of God. That's not our thing. We're supposed to be suspect of the falling world all around us. At least that's what our tradition tells us. It's nice to study other religions, to learn about their perspective, but their perspective is not ours. We don't worship images, beautiful things. So what are we supposed to do with the concept like Darshan? The summer between my freshman and sophomore years in college, I spent the summer in England. I had heard about a program that allows American college students to get a temporary work visa to work in the UK, and I jumped at the chance. I lived in London for a bit and worked in a pub, and that's got its own stories for another time. But then I traveled around the country, staying in hostels and eating food that I bought at local grocery stores. At one point, I visited Cambridge, England. It was fun to see the other Cambridge. And outside of Cambridge is the village of Ely that has a famous cathedral that I studied in high school. So one morning I woke up early. Back then I was doing nothing by myself, so sure, 5:36 in the morning wasn't that big a deal. I woke up early and took the train, 20 minutes, from Cambridge to Ely. And when I reached the cathedral, it was just past 7 in the morning, right around 7. And seeing no one around, there was really not a soul in sight, I wandered inside. Just me and Ely Cathedral. And the space was breathtaking. I was alone in this Gothic masterpiece, huge Gothic masterpiece, the only soul. And the light, the morning light, as it came over the horizon and poured through the stained glass windows, you should have seen it. One of the most notable aspects of Ely, for those of you who've been there or studied it, is that there are windows at the top of the tower that rises above the center part of the nave, what they call the lantern in Ely Cathedral. And as you approach the altar at that time of day, the light from the windows high above bathes the altar with this sublime light. I stood there in awe. I felt the presence of God all around me. I can close my eyes and relive that moment and remember it now, even 20 years later. Of course, as I was exiting, one of the people was like, "Did you pay your fee to get in?" and started to chase me off the grounds, but that's beside the point. What do we as Protestants make of these types of beautiful spaces? Things built by human hands that still have the power to elevate us and elevate our souls to the divine. I've stood before works of art museums and likewise been in awe, as I'm sure you have many times. There are some paintings and sculptures that just transfix you. Some element of those works of art seems to point beyond the piece to something that is sublime, even divine. To look at that work of art brings with it a sense of darshan, of sight, of divine sight. You know what I mean? What do we do about this reality? This powerful notion of darshan, where the eyes of God see you. There's also the pilgrimage aspect that darshan carries with it. It has its own particular religious significance, and I'm sure that there are those places that you've wanted to visit and see. Some object, some building, some work of art. You might have studied it before, as I had studied Ely Cathedral, and you planned your trip to visit it. That very process of planning the trip, of reading about it beforehand, spending the money, taking the time, brings that extra significance when you finally get the opportunity to view it. You see the art in person. Now, sometimes it must be said it doesn't live up to expectations, but other times, that pilgrimage itself, which is so inherent in the Hindu tradition, that pilgrimage itself brings power to that darshan. In some ways, what's amazing to me is that I can't think of an English word that is the equivalent of darshan. There's no word that captures the power, the sublimity, the transcendence of viewing a work of art, particularly one that is imbued with religious import. Darshan. What do we, as Protestants and heirs to the Reformation, do with this concept? If we do we ignore it? But if we do, aren't we missing something important? I'd like to think that we can learn from our Hindu brothers and sisters. Sure, the concept of darshan can be misused, as all religious concepts can. It can seem perfunctory, as it did to me at least, at Shantadevi, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a powerful tool for devotion, for worship. Consider this meeting house. This meeting house, for all its simplicity, has a certain holiness to it. The holiness might be different from a Gothic cathedral or a Baroque basilica, but it's still here. It's here in the brilliant use of natural light. It's here in the interplay between what happens outside between what happens in the space and the swaying trees outside. The light interior makes those who speak stand out all the more and focuses our attention on the spoken word, which is very much by design. These walls intentionally resonate with the sound of congregational singing. Here we can experience darshan, a sight of the divine. Even coming to this space when it's empty and you're on your own can be profoundly transcendent. One thing I'd love to do is be able to find some way to have this space open more during the day so people can come in and use it for prayer and devotion. Now, what can we do to take advantage of this concept of darshan? I'm overjoyed that we're bringing back the Art in the Narthex program so that the art of local artists can once again be displayed on our walls. Can we appreciate that art as more than simply decoration? I personally am considering purchasing some modern-day icons, contemporary images of the great saints of the church and even Jesus himself. Not some whitewashed Jesus from the Middle Ages that doesn't quite speak to me, but an image that does speak to me, that has darshan. What else can we do with this concept? Does it mean buying a contemporary sculpture for our church grounds? How can we be more aware of the aesthetic elements of faith in spite of our Reformation roots? And how might we be able to use that in our own devotional life? How can you make darshan real for you? I want you to think about that and consider that this week and the weeks to come. This is what it means to be changed by our interaction with other faiths. We don't worship other gods, but we see in the faith practices of others elements that can enrich our own faith tradition. Perhaps darshan is one such practice. Maybe it can help us and, in the process, lead us to a greater appreciation of the myriad of religious expressions around the globe. I can't think of a better way to honor World Communion Sunday.